My sister looked me in the face and said I would never be on their level, so I reached into my bag, pulled out one single sheet of paper, and slid the $160 million acquisition receipt across the table without saying a word. She said it at brunch. Not in private. Not in the car on the way there or in a pulled-aside whisper before the food arrived. At the table. With 7 people sitting around it. My mother to my left. My brother-in-law Conrad to her right. 3 of my sister's friends whose names I had been told and would not remember because they all had the same quality of looking at me and finding nothing worth focusing on. My sister Diane set down her mimosa and looked directly at me and said, "You have to understand, Mara. Some people just have a ceiling. And yours is not anywhere near our level. That is not cruel. It is just true." The table did not go silent. That was the part that stayed with me afterward. It did not go silent because the people around it had heard Diane talk this way before and had learned to keep the ambient noise going, to reach for bread or refill a water glass or find something on their plate that suddenly needed attention, because silence would have required them to have a position and nobody at that table wanted a position. My mother picked up her fork. "My name is Mara. I am 38 years old. I had driven 90 minutes to be at that brunch. I was wearing clothes I had pulled on without thinking because the morning had been complicated by a call from my lawyer at 7 that ran longer than expected. I had a bag on the chair beside me that I had carried in from the car without opening since the night before. Inside that bag was a folder. Inside that folder was one piece of paper I had printed at 11 the previous evening and slid into the folder without ceremony and placed in the bag because I had known, with the specific certainty of someone who has been watching a situation develop for a long time, that this brunch was going to require it. I want to tell you about Diane before I tell you what I did next. Diane was 41 and had married Conrad at 29 and had spent the 11 years since doing the specific work of building a life that was legible as successful from the outside. Conrad came from money, the particular kind that had been in a family long enough that nobody discussed it directly, it was simply the water the family swam in. He had a company that his father had handed him and that he had grown moderately and that provided a lifestyle that Diane had arranged herself inside of with the precision of someone who understood that proximity to wealth was its own form of currency. They had a house with a name, the kind of house people referred to by the name of the street rather than the address. They had memberships. They had a table at a restaurant that did not take reservations from people who did not have tables. What Diane had decided about me was something that had calcified over years into a position she no longer examined. I had started a company at 31 with savings and a business partner named Felix and a specific problem I had identified in the logistics software space, which I understood because I had spent 4 years working inside it and watching the same inefficiencies produce the same losses in the same places. The first 3 years had been the specific grinding reality of building something real, which is nothing like the version people describe afterward. It was long and unglamorous, and there were 8 months in year 2 when I was not certain the company would survive, and I did not tell anyone in my family because the information would have been received as confirmation of something they already believed. Diane had believed, from the beginning, that what I was doing was a prolonged detour before I accepted the ceiling she had identified for me. She said this in different ways at different times over 7 years. I was being impractical. I was chasing something that was not realistic. I was confusing activity with progress. She said these things with the specific warmth of someone who believed she was offering useful perspective rather than constructing a narrative that made her own choices feel more secure. 7 years. I had been building for 7 years. 3 weeks before this brunch, at 11 at night, I had signed the paperwork that finalized the acquisition of my company by a firm that had been circling it for 14 months. The acquisition value was $160 million. Felix had called me after we both signed and we had talked for 20 minutes, and then I had sat alone in my home office in the quiet and looked at the wall for a while. I had not told my family yet. Not because I was hiding it. Because I had wanted to understand it myself first, to sit inside it for a few weeks without other people's reactions reshaping how it felt. I had told 2 people. Felix and my friend Dara, who had been present for most of the 7 years and who had said when I told her, very quietly, I knew it. That was all. Just that. I knew it. I had the acquisition summary in my bag because I had printed it the night before after Diane called to confirm the brunch time and mentioned, in passing, that Conrad had some news to share and that it was going to be a good morning for the family. I had understood from the tone of that call, from the specific quality of Diane's warmth on the phone, that the brunch had a purpose. That Conrad's news was going to be the occasion for a particular kind of table arrangement in which certain people were positioned as having arrived somewhere and certain other people were positioned as still en route. I had put the paper in my bag and driven 90 minutes. The table had been talking about Conrad's news for 20 minutes when Diane said what she said. Conrad had expanded into a new market, a significant move that had required a year of preparation, and that was genuinely impressive, and that I had listened to with the full attention it deserved. The table had celebrated it appropriately. My mother had asked good questions. Conrad had been gracious about it, less performative than Diane, a quality I had always noticed about him that made me think he understood something about the situation that he had chosen not to say out loud. Then the conversation had shifted, the way conversations shift at tables like this, toward the general landscape of where everyone was and what they were doing, and someone had asked about my work, one of the friends whose name I would not remember, and I had started to answer it. Diane had reached the end of whatever patience she had maintained through the first 40 minutes of the meal and said it. Some people just have a ceiling. Yours is not anywhere near our level. Not cruel. Just true. My mother picked up her fork. The friend who had asked about my work found something on her plate. Conrad looked at his glass. The ambient noise of the table continued because the people around it had learned to keep it going. I looked at Diane. She met my eyes with the specific steadiness of someone who has said something they have been thinking for a long time and has finally decided the effort of not saying it was no longer worth it. She looked certain. She looked like a person who had identified a truth and delivered it and was waiting for the room to absorb it. I reached into my bag. I did not say anything. I did not shift my expression. I found the folder without looking, the same way you find something you have been carrying long enough that your hand knows exactly where it is. I opened the folder under the table. I took out the single piece of paper. I held it for a moment. Then I placed it on the table in front of me, face down, and slid it slowly across to Diane. She looked at it. She looked at me. She picked it up. The table went quiet for the first time. I watched her read it. I had printed the acquisition summary the night before, one page, clean formatting, the kind of document that said everything it needed to say without requiring additional explanation. Company name. Acquiring firm. Date. Value. $160 million. Diane read it twice. I could tell because her eyes moved across the page and then moved across it again, and the second time was slower than the first. Conrad leaned slightly toward her, not enough to read it fully, enough to catch the number. He went very still. My mother, to my left, had stopped using her fork. Nobody said anything. I picked up my mimosa. I took a sip. I set it down. I looked at the window beside the table, at the street outside where two people were walking a dog in the autumn morning, unhurried, going nowhere specific. The paper sat in Diane's hands. She set it on the table. She looked at me. The certainty that had been in her face when she said not cruel, just true was not there anymore. What had replaced it was something I had not seen on Diane's face in 11 years of watching it, which was the specific expression of a person standing inside a miscalculation they cannot immediately calculate their way out of. I did not say anything. I did not need to. The paper had said it. The silence was saying the rest. And the table, which had kept its ambient noise running through everything Diane had delivered in 41 years of delivering things, was completely quiet for the first time since I had sat down. Conrad picked up his water glass. He took a drink. He set it back down carefully. Outside, the two people with the dog turned a corner and disappeared. The brunch ended without ceremony 40 minutes later. Food was finished. The bill was handled. People collected their things with the specific efficiency of a table that has had something happen in it and is ready to be somewhere else. One of the friends touched my arm on the way out and said, very quietly, "Congratulations." I said thank you. She nodded and moved toward the door. Conrad stopped beside me on the sidewalk while Diane said goodbye to her friends 10 feet away. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I had no idea." I said, "I know." He said, 7 years. Not a question. Just the number, held up and examined. I said yes. He said, "That is extraordinary work, Mara." He said it plainly, without performance, the way he said the few things he said directly. I said thank you. He moved to where Diane was standing and she took his arm and they walked to their car, and I watched them go and then I walked to mine. I drove 90 minutes home with the radio on low and the folder on the passenger seat, and the specific quality of someone who has put down something they have been carrying for a long time and is still learning what it feels like to have empty hands. My phone was quiet for most of the drive. Then, 40 minutes out, a text from my mother. It said, "Call me when you are home." I called her when I was home. She picked up immediately, which told me she had been holding the phone. She said, "Why did you not tell us?" I sat at my kitchen table in the clothes I had pulled on that morning. I said, "I needed to understand it myself first." She said, $160 million, Mara. The number in her mouth had a different quality than it had on the page. Something between disbelief and something older, something she was working through in real time. I said, "Yes." She said, "Felix too?" I said, "Felix too." We split it according to the equity structure. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did not know." I want you to know that I did not know, and I have been sitting here for 40 minutes thinking about the things I did not say at that table. I said, Mom, she said. I picked up my fork. I said, I know, she said. That was wrong. I said, yes, she said. I am sorry. I said, I know. We talked for an hour. Not about the acquisition and not about the money. About the 7 years, which she had watched from the specific distance of a mother who had been listening to Diane's interpretation of those years for so long that she had stopped applying her own. She said things that were honest, and that cost her something to say, and I sat with them and did not soften them for her because softening them would have been a disservice to what they were. Diane called 3 days later. I had been waiting to see when she would call and what register she would use when she did. She called on a Wednesday evening, and her voice had none of the brunch warmth and none of the brunch certainty. What it had was the flatness of someone who has been sitting with something for 72 hours and has arrived, not comfortably, at the place where it has to be addressed. She said, I want to talk about Sunday. I said, I'm listening. She said, what I said was wrong. A pause. Not wrong because of the paper. Wrong before the paper. Wrong when I said it. I did not respond immediately. She said, I have been saying versions of that to you for years. I told myself it was honesty. I told myself I was being realistic with you because nobody else would. Another pause. I was protecting something. I did not want to look at what I was protecting, so I called it concern. I said, what were you protecting? The silence was long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said, the way things were arranged. You in one place and Conrad and me in another. I had decided that was the arrangement and I needed it to stay that way, and every time you kept building I found a new way to make it smaller. She said, that is not something I am proud of. I sat with that for a moment. I said, I know, she said, that is all you were going to say. I said, what else is there? She said, I thought you would be angrier. I said, I spent a lot of years being angry about it. I stopped when I understood that the building was more important than the anger. She was quiet. I said, you said what you said on Sunday, and I put the paper on the table, and that was the whole conversation. Everything after that is about whether we build something different from here. She said, do you want to? I thought about it honestly. I said, yes. But different means different. It means you do not get to be certain about my ceiling anymore. It means when I tell you something about my life, you receive it without running it through the filter you have been using. She said, that is fair. I said, I know it is. We talked for a while longer, and then we said goodbye, and the call ended, and I sat in my kitchen in the quiet and thought about 11 years of a particular arrangement, and what it was going to cost both of us to build a different one. Felix and I went to dinner that Friday. A real restaurant, the kind of dinner the occasion deserved, the one we had promised ourselves when the deal closed. We sat across from each other and ordered things without looking at the prices for the first time in 7 years, and we talked about the beginning, the specific texture of the first year when we were operating on savings, and the particular faith of people who have committed to something before they have proof it will work. He said, do you remember the meeting in year 2 where we almost lost the Henderson contract? I said, I remember every detail of that meeting, including what I was wearing. He laughed. He said, I thought we were finished. I said, I thought we were finished for about 4 hours, and then I called you and you said we were not finished, and I believed you. He said, I was not certain. I said, I know. I believed you anyway. He raised his glass. I raised mine. We did not say anything. We did not need to. The acquisition had a transition period of 6 months during which I remained involved with the company in a consulting capacity. I spent those 6 months doing the specific work of handing something over carefully, making sure the thing I had built was understood by the people taking it before I stepped back from it. On the last day of the transition period, I walked out of the building at 5 in the afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt the specific weight of something completed and the specific lightness of hands that were empty and ready. I called Dara. She picked up on the second ring. I said, it is done, she said. How do you feel? I thought about it. I said, like I have been carrying something for 7 years and I just put it down and my arms are still in the shape of holding it. She said, that passes. I said, I know. She said, come over. I went over. We sat in her kitchen and she made food and we talked until late, and it was exactly the right way to end the day. My mother came to see me a month after the brunch. She drove the 90 minutes herself, which she had not done in 2 years, the drive always having been mine to make. She came on a Saturday and we spent the day together, ordinary things, the market and lunch and a walk that went longer than planned because the afternoon was good and neither of us wanted to turn back. On the walk she said, I want to understand the 7 years. I want you to tell me what they actually were, not the version I received secondhand. I told her. Not everything, but the shape of it, the real shape. The year 2 near collapse. The exam in year 3 that I had failed and rebuilt from, which she had not known about. The 14 months of acquisition negotiations. She listened without interrupting, which was new, and when I finished she said, I was not paying the right kind of attention. I said, "No," she said, "I'm going to pay better attention." I said, "I know." Diane and I have lunch every few weeks. It is not easy and it is not pretending to be easy, and that honesty is the first real thing we have built together in 11 years. She asks questions about the next thing I'm working on and she stays in the answers without running them through the filter. I ask about Conrad's company and she tells me without performing what it means. We are learning, slowly, the specific grammar of two people who have decided to see each other correctly for the first time. Conrad sent me a message 2 weeks after the brunch. A short one. He said, "I have been thinking about what it takes to build something for 7 years with no guarantee. I wanted to say that I respect it completely and I should have said so at the table." He did not mention Diane. He did not mention the paper. Just that. I wrote back, "Thank you." It meant something. He replied, "I know. That is why I sent it." The paper is in the folder in my home office. I have not framed it or displayed it. It lives in the folder in the drawer where I keep documents that matter. I know exactly where it is and I take it out occasionally, not to look at the number but to look at the date, which is the real thing on it, the date that marks 7 years of work arriving at its conclusion. Some people decide your ceiling before they have seen your foundation. They measure you from where they are standing and they call that accuracy. They deliver the measurement with the specific warmth of someone doing you a service, and they believe, genuinely, that what they are offering is the truth. They are offering their fear in the shape of your limitation. The ceiling they identified for you is the height they stopped at and called the top. You do not have to stop there. Build past it. Build quietly, in the specific grinding unglamorous way of someone who has decided that what they are constructing matters more than what anyone else is saying about it. Build through year 2 when you are not certain it will survive. Build through the conversations at tables where the ambient noise keeps going because nobody wants to have a position. Build until you have something that fits on one piece of paper. Then slide it across without saying a word. Let the silence finish the sentence. It will say everything that 7 years of building was too busy to say out loud.